We're doing these low light photos, and before I get started, I have to acknowledge a couple of things that are important when you're flying and shooting this. First of all, I've shot these photos at 1.67 of a second with no ISO. That's on a Mavic 2 Pro. It has a good sensor for low light. It has a full 1-inch sensor. You can still do this with a Mavic 1 or a tiny sensor like a Phantom 3. I have tons of low light photos that I've done that came out totally fine. You might have to shoot a little bit longer, like 2.5 seconds, but when you're shooting downtown with a ton of city lights and cars, 1.67 seems to be totally fine no matter what you're shooting on. And honestly, the Mavic 2 Pro, as many things as it's good at, it isn't good with low light because it gives you a lot of grain. I mean, it's sensitive to the light, but any dark spots get this weird grain in it, so it's not like that's a perfect camera anyway. And you can recover most of that in the edit. It won't look as good, but it's still completely doable, and I have tons of photos, so don't be intimidated by that. So I'm shooting in RAW, always shooting RAW, don't trust the JPEGs. And the other thing, in general, if you're gonna go out and do any shooting, just get in the habit of getting closer to things and shooting in panorama, because you can crop out any side that you don't want to use and it gives you a ton more data to work with. So if you're shooting with a smaller sensor and a smaller megapixel photo, like the 12 megapixel photo from a Mavic or a Phantom, you can make up for that by just shooting a lot of photos and stacking them together. Nobody's going to tell the difference. It looks a million times better. So you can download the photos I've given you here. There's 3 of them, and we're going to stack these into a panorama. So in Lightroom, you go to File, Import, wherever you save them to, bring them in. Here's these 3. First thing you should notice, they look like doo-doo. We go to the Develop tab, and you can see that super yellow, gross tinge. We do not want to touch these photos with a 10-foot pole, but we're going to fix all that. So highlight them all together, right-click, Photo Merge, Panorama. It's going to take a second to build this for you, and when it does, you have this nice, much better looking stack. You have a couple of options here. Check Auto Crop. You can do spherical, cylindrical, or perspective. Perspective is great, but it's more for like if you're sitting at the top of a 900-foot tower and it gives you all that depth. Otherwise, I tend to stick to cylindrical just with these tall ones because I kind of like that barrel look and I want this to fit on Instagram and this looks better tall. Spherical just came out too long. Not that it makes a huge difference anyways, but this is the one we're going to go with, cylindrical, and press merge. So now we have this photo all together. Very first thing I typically do with night photos is change the white balance until it doesn't look an awful tone. I know that street lights in general are a lot below daylight, which is 5400, so this is what we'll work with for now, and I'm just going to play with these to see how I think that's a good starting point. We can always adjust later. Exposure and contrast, don't touch these until we've done stuff with all the rest of it. Highlights, again, usually throwing things back and forth is the best way to get an idea of how this is going to look, but nighttime photos tend to need to be close to complete before you get an idea of what these are going to really be. So I can't just adjust highlights and then not come back to it. I'm going to have to play with all these settings together. And normally in a photo, you can hold shift and double click and it'll automatically go to what you should set it to or what Lightroom thinks you should set it to. But because the light in this photo is weird anyways, and we're going for something artsy with all the glow, I don't think Lightroom's really going to help us a lot. I'm going to keep that around there anyway, just because I want to be able to see a little bit more under these lights when I bring it up later, because I know I'm going to raise the exposure a little bit. Shadows, ironically, don't touch these unless you're maybe bringing them down a little bit to add some contrast. I noticed that this gives it a really fake look that everybody tends to jump for, and it brightens the whole thing, but it doesn't add the contrast and the glow that we want. So maybe +5. Whites are really important, because that is what's going to give us this nice shiny glow on anything with color to it, or street lights or cars whizzing by. And then blacks, I'm going to raise these a tiny bit just because you can see that in this little thing we're pushing way too far into the drop-off zone of no data, and I want to raise that a tiny bit. Also, you can see what I'm talking about. If you look right at this mountain, it's just totally black if we drop this at all. So you see how we're losing all that data if we drop. I mean, blacks are only -10 here and we're still losing half the mountain, so it's not the end of the world, still up to you, but I'm just going to add, I don't know, 8, just to give it a little texture. The next one probably adds the biggest difference to nighttime photos. That's clarity, and I throw mine up like super high. You can see immediately that added so much to the photo. I'll keep it around 50. Same with the vibrance, because anything glowing with a color to it, and there's so many colors going on because there's so many different light temperatures with street lights and headlights and whatnot else, this is kind of important. So vibrance 45, saturation just a little bit for fun, but if you add too much, it's going to make those street lights way too yellow. So I guess that's your call, but for me, I'm only going to do like 10. Split toning, hue, saturation, and lighting, all those things that typically work well with daylight when you have clouds and you can play with the colors and the tones of, you know, sunsets and things like that. I don't think they really help here. You're working with some very hard constants. Lights in some spots, no lights in the others. And that contrast is what we want to exaggerate, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. You can run through here, and if there's something red you really want to add some glow to, go ahead, of course, Don't listen to me because I spend all of my time playing around with this anyways. I mean, half the photos I come in thinking this looks stupid, and then I toy with it, and then I like it, and then I just wind up posting it. So it looks like I had a plan from the beginning, and I absolutely did not. It's just that I screwed around with buttons for a while, and then it started to look nice. So if you want to play with things like that, like maybe the blue here, go ahead. Detail, sharpen, not too much, and noise reduction. This will really help to smooth things, especially since most of this is really shadowy and there's a ton of grain in the sky. I'm only going to add a little bit. I'm not going to add a vignette because it's nighttime, so come on. Lens correction is important here. Click on manual and constrained crop, and that is because in this photo in particular, the perspective where I'm sitting at, it's right over this building. It lets us either, maybe if this was a long shot of a road, I'd want to extend it out like that to maybe add some depth to it. I don't want to do that though. Here I want to pump up the building a tiny bit just so you can see that we're sitting right at the top of this thing and it's really tall. So minus 11, and that gives it a little bit better perspective on how high we are above this building. Contrast is something that I do at the end after I've added every other setting because it's the fastener that exaggerates all the changes you already made to the entire thing. So it adds here a little bit of glow to the light, but not a lot because it's already black and the whites are already very white. So you're not going to see a ton of difference unless you went way high, but that kills the shadows. So I'm only going to stick around 20. And just a little bit of exposure to brighten this whole thing up. I mean, barely any. There's a couple of things that we can play with in this photo. And I always say that the biggest difference between getting a bunch of attention on Instagram and tons of views and the normal guys is the adjustment brush. What you paint over and what you pay special attention to make sure that it's corrected or it looks nice versus just adding general settings to the entire photo. Because we added contrast and light settings to this whole thing. If we were to take extra special care now and zoom in on some of the lights in the background, click on the adjustment brush, make it tiny, and then just draw right over the street. That's the only thing I want to color right now. Usually I draw a little bit and then add some exposure so you can see where you're drawing. I don't want to keep that. I just want to know what I'm doing. Then once that's all colored in, I'll drop the exposure back down. And let's see how it looks first of all with a ton of clarity. That's kind of an edgy look. I think I like it with clarity down though. I could look good with both. I'm going to take it down, and the next thing I usually do is change the color temperature. So this goes back to that yellow amateur tinge you see on everybody with night photos who doesn't know how to fix this stuff. We want to stay as far away from that as we can. So I'm going to make it look a little grayer. And that looks pretty cool with clarity. I want clarity down though. Saturation up. Looks pretty neat. Normally I'd say add a new brush and then draw right over all this in the sky. Let me just do it really quickly so you can get an idea what I'm talking about. And then change the color temperature so it looks a little bluer. I'm just going to change mine to a little purple, a little blue. It's exaggerated, but it was just plain gray, and I think it was a bit cloudy that night, so there isn't a lot to work with anyway, but this looks pretty cool. If you really want to, you can add another new brush here, and draw just over particular areas of light and change their temperature as well to see what that does. Maybe we'll make this pink if we want to draw a ton of attention to it. Like if I was doing this photo for this building, for the people who own this, I would spend a lot of time making this look really cool or trying to bring some attention to it, but that's maybe a reach. You don't have to do that. One thing I do want to fix though that's aggravating me is another weird tinge we got from these lights down here, this green. So I'm adding a new brush, coloring just over the green. You might even want to turn down the flow a little bit and then raise the brush size so that you can get kind of the general area but not too harsh, and then draw a ton right in the harsh spots where the light is shining. And then once we have that all covered, we can come in here and take the green right out of that. Blue a little bit. Or you know what, just you can desaturate it actually. Or maybe, you know what, green is why you took this photo and you saw these lights and were really inspired. You want to leave the green, whatever, it's up to you. I'm raising exposure a little bit and clarity up just because I don't know, I have no reason, but that's what I'm doing. And then more brushes. We can draw a brush over here over all these really pretty city lights and see how it looks if we add or take away clarity. So clarity gone versus tons of clarity. I think that looks a lot cooler. We can make it bluer, a little orange. That might be okay. Now that I'm looking at it, I think that sky's too blue, so I'm taking that back in some, a little less purple. And then I'll switch back over to this brush. Saturation, I think that looks good. So here we have a much better looking picture, and again, I always zoom out to the farthest view, or at least a smaller view, to see what it looks like if it was going on Instagram and that was a thumbnail. Because a lot of times I'll edit a photo, looks super nice, looks really accurate, and then I put it on Instagram, it's this big, nobody cares, because, you know, it doesn't bring any attention to it. So I edit my photos tall usually, and I do a balance between zooming out to see how they look with a thumbnail, if they're still attractive as they are blown up, and I edit for a balance between those. But that's pretty much it, top to bottom. Download these files, practice with it, and remember, when you're shooting these, no ISO ever. It doesn't matter what drone you're on. And typically, to get little trails back there, 1.67 of a second. And the last thing, keep your eye on your drone. Get as close to that building as you can. I mean, like 10 feet away from it. That way, when you shoot the panorama, it'll look like it's a little farther away, but I was very close to this rooftop. That is what gives me this really deep, cool perspective on how tall it is. So keep that in mind, and go give it a shot.